Dear students, welcome back to the series of lessons on Class 8 History, Social Science. In today's episode, we will continue our study on Chapter 9 of your textbook, The Making of the National Movement. In today's episode, we will be studying one of the most interesting topics of our freedom struggle, that is the civil disobedience movement. The major objectives of today's lesson are to study the course of the Dandi March and other parallel salt satyagrahas, compare the non-cooperation movement and the civil disobedience movement, analyze the impact of the civil disobedience movement, understand the role of women in India's freedom struggle, and study the influence of World War II on Indian freedom movement. After studying today's lesson, you will be able to explain the unfolding of the civil disobedience movement, examine the impact of the civil disobedience movement on British rule, and analyze the role of women in India's freedom movement. Dear students, until now in this chapter, you have studied the emergence of nationalism in the country, that is the birth of the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League. You have also studied the ideologies of the moderates, the extremists and revolutionaries such as Dadabhai Naoroji, Bipin Chandra Pal, Bal Gangadhar Tilak, Lala Lajpat Rai, and so on. You also studied the concept of Swaraj, the partition of Bengal, and finally the Swadeshi movement. Later on, you dealt with the advent of mass nationalism with the coming of Mahatma Gandhiji to India. Gandhiji, through his idea of Satyagraha, launched a few movements, that is in Champaran, Kheda, and Ahmedabad, about which you studied in the previous episode. We then studied in depth about the Rowlatt Satyagraha, that was against the Rowlatt Act in 1919, and the non-cooperation and Khilafat movement in 1920. All these movements significantly contributed to the rise of nationalism in India. In the 1920s, there was an agitation against the Simon Commission, about which you studied in the previous episode. You also studied the heroism of Bhagat Singh, who threw 2 bombs in the parliament, for which he was hanged on 23 March 1931. After all these series of events right from 1885 to 1929, it was now time for the last phase of the Indian freedom movement. It would be these 17 years from 1930 to 1947 that would ultimately lead to independence and partition of India. Therefore, in today's episode, we will study one of these very important movements from 1930 to 1935, that is the civil disobedience movement. In 1929, Jawaharlal Nehru formalized the Purna Swaraj Declaration in Lahore, according to which 26th January of every year would be celebrated as Independence Day. Gandhiji was given the task to mobilize people for this movement. Therefore, Gandhiji chose the concept of salt as a medium to mobilize people. Why do you think Gandhiji took up the issue of salt? Can you imagine a meal without salt in it? Yes, salt forms the basic ingredient for almost any meal you eat. Salt is consumed by all sections of the society, irrespective of whether they are rich or poor, man or woman, Hindu or Muslim, North Indian or South Indian. Salt could therefore be used as a connection between all kinds of people in the country, which could mobilize people. But what was the problem associated with salt? Let us find out. During the British rule, salt could be produced only by the British companies and not by an individual Indian. Indians had to purchase salt from the market, which also carried heavy taxes. Since salt was one of the ingredients that every individual in the country used, Gandhiji thought of using this as a medium for his next satyagraha. Thus originated the idea of a salt satyagraha, or popularly known as the Dandi March. The plan was to march from Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad all the way to the coast of Dandi, where Gandhiji and his followers would make salt, thus breaking the law of the British. The satyagraha began on 12th of March 1930 with Gandhiji and his 78 followers marching from Sabarmati Ashram. They marched tirelessly for 375 kilometers and rested in nearby villages throughout their journey. Gandhiji seized this opportunity to talk to the remote villagers, understand their problems, explain the idea of freedom movement, and finally encourage them to join our struggle. Throughout the journey, Gandhiji encouraged and inspired a number of people. The group finally reached Dandi on 5th of April 1930 and broke the salt law on the next day, that is on 6th of April 1930, by evaporating the seawater and producing salt. This marked the beginning of the civil disobedience movement. What was the civil disobedience movement? Throughout the country, a number of people broke the salt law, manufactured salt, and demonstrated in front of salt manufacturing companies. As the movement spread, they boycotted foreign goods and picketed liquor shops. Peasants refused to pay the chowkidari and revenue taxes, village officials resigned, and forest people broke the forest laws. Did you notice any difference between the civil disobedience movement and the non-cooperation movement you studied in the previous episode? In the non-cooperation movement, people were asked not to cooperate with the British government, embrace Indian goods, boycott foreign goods, and also give up government titles. But in the civil disobedience movement, people were asked to break the laws that suppress the rights of common man, such as the salt law, the chowkidari tax, and the forest laws. However, in both these movements, the idea of satyagraha and non-violence were strongly upheld by Gandhiji. There were many parallel movements that happened across the country along with the broader civil disobedience movement. One of them was the Vedaranyam Satyagraha that took place in Tamil Nadu. The Vedaranyam Satyagraha was headed by C. Rajagopalachari and began on 12th of April 1930 from the place of Tiruchirappalli in Tamil Nadu to the coast of Vedaranyam on the Bay of Bengal. The group reached Vedaranyam on April 28th and broke the salt law by manufacturing salt on April 30. A similar satyagraha happened in a place called Ankola in Karnataka, where 40,000 volunteers gathered to break the salt law. In Nagaland, Rani Gaidenliu joined the civil disobedience movement at the age of 13 and was imprisoned by the British government. She was later released and set free in 1947 by the independent government of India. Another important feature of the civil disobedience movement was the large-scale participation of women. During Gandhiji's Dandi March, a number of women came out of their homes to listen to Gandhiji. They also joined Gandhiji in manufacturing salt, breaking the salt law, boycotting foreign goods, and picketing liquor shops. Many women even went to jail. One such woman was Ambabai of Karnataka, who was married at the age of 12 and widowed at the age of 16. She picketed foreign cloth and liquor shops and was arrested multiple times by the British government. Between her prison terms, she made speeches and taught spinning. Do you know the story of any person from your region or state who participated in the civil disobedience movement? Now you have understood that the civil disobedience movement was larger and broader than the non-cooperation movement. But what was the impact of the civil disobedience movement? How far was it successful in achieving its goals? Let us find out. The civil disobedience movement inspired large sections of the society to join the freedom struggle. The ideas of satyagraha and non-violence had reached all corners of the country, with people from different regions breaking laws of the British in their own way. Many regional movements and satyagrahas arose parallelly to the main movement and contributed to the freedom struggle. Women participated in large numbers, which was the driving force of the civil disobedience movement as they broke laws, boycotted foreign goods, and picketed liquor shops. The British realized that they could not rule over India forever and had to share some of the powers with the Indians to sustain their rule. Therefore, the Government of India Act was passed in 1935, which shared some of the administrative powers with the Indians. This concept was called provincial autonomy. Provincial autonomy meant that Indians could form governments at the provincial levels and take certain decisions independently. However, they would still be ruled by the British at the center in New Delhi. Now, can you tell if the civil disobedience movement was a success or a failure? Yes, the civil disobedience movement was a large success, but just fell short of getting us complete independence. Elections to the provincial legislature under the Government of India Act were conducted in 1937, where both parties of the Indian National Congress and the All India Muslim League participated. Only 14% of the total population of India was allowed to vote. The elected representatives were Indians and were from the Indian National Congress and the Muslim League. They promoted civil liberties, allowed peasant organizations and trade unions to function, removed restrictions on the press, curbed the powers of the police, and finally released political prisoners. Support was given to local and village industries. People felt that they were already experiencing partial independence, as the political leaders who were in jail until some time ago were now able to rule the provinces and help people. Everything was peaceful until 1939. Can you recall from your previous classes what happened in 1939? Yes, in 1939, the World War II broke out in Europe and quickly spread across the world. The British too joined the war. During the war, the British announced India's participation in favor of the British even without consulting the Congress leaders or its citizens. Therefore, as a matter of protest for not respecting the decisions of Indians, the INC leaders resigned from their posts in the provincial legislature. But the British badly required Indian soldiers to fight for the British in the World War II. The Indian National Congress leaders announced that they would fully support British in the war only if India would be granted complete independence after the war. In order to gather support of the Indian leaders, the British government in London sent a mission called the Crips Mission in 1942. The demands placed by the Indian leaders were not accepted by this mission. Indians asked for a complete independence soon after the war ended, but the British were ready to increase the freedom of the provincial legislature, that too after the war. Hence, both parties could not arrive at a mutual decision and the Crips Mission failed. The immediate result of the failure of the Crips Mission was the launching of the Quit India movement. The Quit India movement was the final attempt by the Indian National Congress leaders to end British rule in India. This movement was very different from the non-cooperation movement and the civil disobedience movement. We shall study about the Quit India movement in the next episode, which forced the British to think of leaving India forever. Dear students, that brings us to the end of this episode. Let us recall what we have learnt. During the British rule, salt could be produced only by the British companies and not by an Indian. Indians had to purchase salt from the markets, which also carried a heavy tax. Gandhiji thought to use this to unite Indians for another satyagraha. The Dandi March was organized from Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad on 12th of March 1930 to Dandi, where Gandhiji broke the salt law on 6th of April 1930 by boiling sea water. Thousands in different parts of the country broke the salt law, manufactured salt, and demonstrated in front of government salt factories. Some other salt satyagrahas in the country were the Vedaranyam Satyagraha and the Ankola Satyagraha. As the movement spread, foreign cloth was boycotted and liquor shops were picketed. Peasants refused to pay revenue and chowkidari taxes, village officials resigned, and in many places, forest people violated forest laws. An important feature of the civil disobedience movement was the large-scale participation of women. During Gandhiji's Salt March, thousands of women came out of their homes to listen to him. One such woman was Ambabai of Karnataka, who had been married at the age of 12 and was arrested multiple times. Between her prison terms, she made speeches and taught spinning. The British realized that they could not rule over India forever and had to share some of the powers with Indians in order to sustain their rule. Therefore, in 1935, the Government of India Act was passed, by which the British shared some of their administrative powers with Indians. Provincial autonomy meant that Indian leaders could form governments at provincial levels and take certain decisions independently. However, they would still be ruled by the British at the centre in New Delhi. During the World War II, as a protest for not respecting the decisions of Indians, the Indian National Congress leaders resigned from their posts in provincial legislature. In order to gather support of the Indians, the British sent a mission from London called the Crips Mission in 1942. The demands placed by Indian leaders were not accepted by the British. Therefore, the Crips Mission failed as it could not convince the Indian leaders to arrive at a mutual decision. The immediate result of the failure of the Crips Mission was the Quit India movement. Let us do. The large-scale participation of women in the civil disobedience movement was a turning point in India's freedom struggle. Explain the statement with suitable examples and reasons and submit it to your teacher. Activity. Find out one local agitation or satyagraha that was launched in your village, region or state in favor of the civil disobedience movement. Who led the movement? How many people participated? Where was it held? Make a report and submit it to your teacher. Dear students, I hope you enjoyed today's class. In the next episode, we will study the final stages of India's freedom struggle, that is the Quit India movement and the events leading to India's partition and independence. Until then, goodbye and happy learning.